part 56 of Don't Say Schwarzenegger. In this part, I'm going to finally explain the meaning behind the title of my series, Don't Say Schwarzenegger, and I'm going to be covering the lead up to our 2021 civil trial, which was a landmark civil trial because we were awarded the largest PTSD settlement of all time, which hasn't been paid, obviously. So several months before a civil trial starts, there's a hearing that's had between the legal teams of both sides and the judge. And both sides are allowed to bring motions in limine, and what that means is it's a request to the judge to exclude, limit, or include evidence before the trial. So reasoning is to prevent opposing side from presenting prejudicial, irrelevant, or inadmissible evidence. And when this meeting was had, Sean Driz, the longtime boyfriend of Christina Schwarzenegger, asked that there be a motion that nobody was allowed to mention the Schwarzenegger name in any of the hearings. And the judge shot it down because she was like, yeah, but you said her name multiple times, Christina Schwarzenegger. You've brought it up multiple times, so it's out there. Love the judge. And I figured if they didn't want us to say the name, I'd call my series Don't Say Schwarzenegger. Also, if that motion was allowed by the judge, I seriously considered at the time in 2021 to legally changing my name to The Schwarzeneggers Are Involved. And just changing it to that for the trial and then changing it back to Anne Green. I'm petty. Okay, so now it's June 4th of 2021, 25 days before the trial is supposed to start on June 29th. And my attorney reached out to me and said, hey, a doctor from Cedars-Sinai, an oncologist, my attorney said, an oncologist reached out and said that Maurice Driz, one of the defendants, is recovering, and I'm guessing it's cancer, because an oncologist. And he's asking for a 6-week continuance of the trial. And I'm like, really? Right before the trial? Again, we've already had 6-7 excuses from them that weren't believable. And I was like, no, let me, I don't need to see lab results and stuff like that. I'm not going to do invasion of privacy, but I'd like to just make sure it's an oncologist. So I went and did digging. Took me about 2 days, and I found out, nope, it was not an oncologist from Cedars-Sinai. It was a sports medicine guy. And nowhere in his letter did it say oncologist, and nowhere in his letter did it say cancer. It just said, Maurice Driz is kind of going through something. Can we get a continuance? So that was taken off the table, thanks to me. So despite that, we ended up finding out maybe a couple days later that the trial was going to be delayed, but only a week, be delayed to July 7th of 2021, which is fine. So now let's skip ahead to the day before the trial starts, where we have a final status conference, which is where the judge sits down with just the legal teams. And since the defendants are broke and indigent, they're representing themselves. So it's them, my attorneys, and the judge. And they just sit down and you make sure everybody's on course and ready to go to trial for the day after. Just a little reminder of the 4 defendants: Alberto Daniel Driz, he goes by Daniel Driz, Maurice Driz, Sean Driz, and William Jolson. And the judge was Judge Susan Bryant-Deason, and she works in the federal courthouse downtown LA. And she is the toughest but most prepared, fair judge I've ever been in a room with. And I have been in the room with a lot of judges. Now, as will happen many, many, many times, as I'll cover in the next 20 or so parts, the Drizzes usually just don't feel like showing up for mandatory hearings and stuff like that. They don't show up for the civil trial in most days. They just have like one show up for the rest of them, which is not how it works. William Jolson is the 4th defendant, not related to the Drizzes, and he's the only one that showed up to this final status conference the day before the trial starts. And by the way, I really wish that I had gone to this. My attorneys told us we didn't have to go to this final status conference, but I wish I had, because after getting the transcript, there was so much vital information that was forgotten to be told to the judge, and then also some misstatements on stuff that I 100% would have been prepared for, but can't change the past. So let's go over the final status conference. So to start off, the judge asks William Jolson, what do you do for a living? And he says, I'm a freelance business consultant for marketing. His dad's loaded and owns a ton of the most prominent apartment buildings all around LA. He's like a very rich landlord, and they just sold their house up in the Hollywood Hills or Beverly Hills, something like that, for $20 million around the time this was all happening. So he's started on third base. That's his job. The judge then points out, she goes, I'm upset that you didn't show up to the mandatory settlement conference a week ago, because the plaintiffs all showed up and you showed up at the very end, and then the other guys didn't show up. And he says for his excuse, I guess my microphone on my laptop doesn't work, because this was 2021. So because of COVID, it was a lot of Zoom meetings instead of in-person stuff. By the way, this is going to be the first of like dozens of excuses you're going to hear over these next 20 parts or so. So William, and he probably had this look on his face while he was sitting there in front of the judge in this conference, and he said, you know what? He announces, I no longer want a jury anymore. We can't afford it. And she goes, yeah, that's not really how it works. I'm calling 2 sets of 35 jurors tomorrow. So And the judge says her first statement about understanding what we've been dealing with at this point for 6 years. And she says, I didn't believe what was happening when I took over the case because of their non-appearance and their nonchalance in court and disrespect of the system altogether. And so I thought, this really isn't happening. Well, it really is. I love her. She gets it immediately. And then she mentions that all three Drizzes didn't even bother showing up on the phone for this conference today. Next, the judge is asking basic questions, and she asks my attorneys what the criminal charges were for all the defendants, which I've told you before, it's GBI felonies, among a bunch of other stuff. And my attorneys said they weren't really sure what the criminal charges were, which got the judge rightfully upset. Oops. Then this judge asks my attorneys, well, who is the judge for the criminal? And my attorneys said it was Michael E. Pastor. But that's only kind of correct because they forgot to mention Judge Catherine Mader is the one that let them all loose with all of the probation violations. And then he also forgot to mention Judge Keith L. Schwartz from the airport court, who had the secret illegal hearing when the white powder and the loaded stolen chambered pew-pew was found in the possession of all three Drizzes while on felony probation. Then the judge asks how much time did they serve, and my attorney said they each served 4 months, and then the judge corrected him and said, no, it was 45 days plus 5 years felony probation, so they're still on probation now and for the next 3 months until September of 2021. Then the judge notices that Robert Shapiro was part of their dream team, the criminal defense, and she says, I've tried many cases against him as a lawyer. You bet I always beat him. Swoon. And now here's another moment where I wish I was there, probably the most for this thing, but my attorneys told the judge that, and he said, I quote, if I remember correctly, I don't think that we as the plaintiffs believe a court reporter through the trial is necessary for our purposes. Absolutely not. As you guys can see, like that was a big mistake, but as you can see from my 55 previous parts, that I bought all the transcripts, all the video depositions, everything, and then I found evidence through that helped our case dramatically. So court reporters is a major thing we needed. Huge miscommunication. And the judge, thank God, responded, this is a 14-day trial, long cause. And considering the damages and injuries, the fact that there's 4 defendants representing themselves, quote, I can't even imagine you suggesting not having a court reporter. Thank God. Then she lays out that if we don't have a court reporter, what would happen during this 3-week trial is that the defendants themselves and our attorneys would have to get together at the end of every single court day and together write a joint statement about what all the witnesses said, agree on it, and hand it in. Oh my God! So thank God Judge Susan Bryant-Deason put the smack down on that. And then last but not least, the judge says to our attorneys, she says, yeah, I think we're going to have security for this trial because we're not going to have any disrespectful behavior happening in my courtroom, blah, blah, blah. And I was just so relieved to hear that because terrifying. And by the way, she even said that never in all her years in that federal courthouse has they ever needed security inside the courtroom, but they would always have them prepared outside, because it's not a good look and it might be unfair to the defendants if the security is standing there and stuff, which I totally get. However, by the end of our trial, by like the 3rd week, the security had to be inside and then they had to start walking us to and from our cars because of the things the defendants were doing. So yeah. All right, let's get to the next part. Here we go.